They marched under foreign flags. They fought for empires that would never call them equals. From the deserts of Africa to the trenches of Europe, millions of men from faraway lands were thrown into a war that was not their own. Their names are rarely remembered, their faces barely seen. Yet without them, the Great War could not have been fought or won. This is the story of the Forgotten Armies. When the First World War began in 1914, the European empires stretched across the globe. The British, French, and German colonial domains covered almost every continent, binding hundreds of millions of people to distant rulers they would never meet. And when war erupted in Europe, these colonies became more than possessions. They became sources of manpower, labor, and sacrifice. From the jungles of India to the savannas of Africa, the call to arms spread like wildfire. The imperial governments framed it as duty, loyalty, even honor. But for most of those who answered, it was neither choice nor patriotism. It was obligation, coercion, or the promise of a better life that never came. They would be called the colonial troops, soldiers of color in a white man's war. By the end of the conflict, over 4 million men from Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and Oceania had fought under European banners. They were the unsung engine of the war, the carriers of supplies, the diggers of trenches, the guards of front lines, and the bearers of death. The empire's reach. No empire mobilized more colonial manpower than Britain. From India alone, more than 1.3 million soldiers and laborers served overseas. They fought in Mesopotamia, Gallipoli, East Africa, and on the Western Front. Their names filled recruitment rolls: Sikhs, Gurkhas, Punjabis, Pathans. They left their villages with songs and returned with silence. In France's colonies, nearly 500,000 men were conscripted, from Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Madagascar. They were known as the tirailleurs sénégalais, the Senegalese riflemen. Their skin color made them a curiosity to European civilians, but their courage was undeniable. In the frozen mud of Champagne and the killing fields of Verdun, they stood shoulder to shoulder with white Frenchmen, often sent to the most dangerous positions. In the vast reaches of Africa, the war came home. German colonies in present-day Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, and Togo became battlegrounds. African soldiers fought on both sides, sometimes against their own kin, commanded by officers who saw them as expendable. The East African campaign alone dragged on for years, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives in a war that Europe barely noticed. From Australia and New Zealand came another army. Young men who crossed half the planet to fight for king and country. They landed on the shores of Gallipoli, where thousands died in a campaign doomed from the start. Their courage would become legend, but so would their disillusionment. For the first time, the colonies began to question the price of loyalty, the front lines of inequality. Despite their numbers, colonial soldiers rarely received equal treatment. They were paid less, fed worse, and often denied recognition. In Europe, they faced both admiration and racism. French civilians sometimes cheered them as heroes, yet whispers spread that these black troops were savage or dangerous. German propaganda portrayed them as symbols of imperial hypocrisy, Europeans preaching civilization while sending Africans to die in European mud. In the British Army, segregation was subtle but constant. Indian officers could not command white soldiers. Black Caribbean troops were often relegated to labor units. Even as they fought for freedom, they were denied it themselves. At the front, the horrors were the same. Shellfire did not distinguish by color. Gas drifted over all. In the trenches, brotherhood was born out of necessity. White soldiers often wrote home about their respect for the men from the empire, their endurance, their quiet dignity under fire. But when the guns fell silent, that respect too often faded. The forgotten dead. The war's end in 1918 brought parades and peace treaties, but little gratitude for those who came from afar. Many colonial soldiers were sent home with no pensions, no honors, and no voice. Their sacrifices were buried beneath the triumphs of their imperial masters. In India, thousands of veterans returned to poverty. Some had lost limbs, others their minds. The promises of reform and equality never came. Instead, they returned to a land stirring with the winds of independence. The same men who had fought for empire would now fight against it. In Africa, memorials were few and names were missing. The bodies of tens of thousands of African porters, men forced to carry supplies across the jungles and deserts, were left unburied. They had no graves, no medals, no memory. In East Africa alone, it is estimated that over 100,000 carriers died. Their deaths unrecorded, their families never told. Even in victory, they remained invisible. When the French held their victory parades in Paris, few African soldiers were invited. The British Empire built grand memorials in London, but the colonial names were carved small or not at all. Echoes of rebellion. Yet from this injustice grew something powerful: awareness. The war had shown millions across the world that the empires were not invincible, and that their so-called civilization was soaked in blood. Soldiers who had once bowed to colonial rulers now returned with a new sense of identity. They had fought, suffered, and bled, and now they began to ask why. In India, men who had once worn British uniforms joined the independence movement. Among them was a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi, who had supported the war in 1914, believing it would bring political rights to Indians. By 1919, after seeing the betrayal and the massacre at Amritsar, his faith in empire was gone. In Africa, veterans became the seeds of nationalist movements. In Senegal, Blaise Diagne, the first African elected to the French National Assembly, began calling for equal rights for colonial subjects. Across the continent, from Nigeria to Kenya, the stories of the forgotten soldiers spread quietly but steadily. The same was true in the Caribbean. Men who had fought for Britain returned to islands where they were still treated as inferiors. They began forming associations, unions, and movements that would, decades later, become the foundation of independence struggles. The war that had been meant to preserve empire had, in fact, planted the seeds of its destruction. History's blind spot. For much of the 20th century, the story of the colonial soldiers remained buried. History books spoke of British valor, French courage, German discipline, but rarely of the men who came from Dakar, Lahore, Kingston, or Suva. In official photographs of generals and parades, they were cropped out, standing at the edges of the frame. Only in recent decades have historians begun to uncover their stories. The Indian sepoys who fought at Ypres, the West African riflemen who held their lines at Verdun, the Maori battalions who charged at Gallipoli, the Chinese laborers who dug trenches behind the front. Each was a thread in the vast tapestry of war, woven from forgotten lives. The silence was not accidental. Europe's memory of the Great War was shaped by guilt, grief, and pride, but not by empathy for those it had ruled. To acknowledge the colonial contribution was to confront the reality of empire itself, an uncomfortable truth for nations built on conquest. The weight of memory. Today, as we walk through war cemeteries from France to Tanzania, we find their names, sometimes in English, sometimes in Arabic, sometimes not at all. On one stone, it may simply read "A soldier of the Indian Army, known unto God." On another, Un soldat africain, mort pour la France. Their silence speaks louder than any monument. At the Menin Gate in Ypres, among the 54,000 missing, thousands were from India. At Neuve-Chapelle, a memorial stands for the Indian soldiers. Its inscription reads, "Their name liveth for evermore." Yet for decades their names were barely spoken. In 2018, a century after the armistice, Britain finally commissioned a report acknowledging that Black and Asian troops had been unjustly excluded from memorials. It was a gesture long overdue, a reminder that remembrance is not just about who died, but about who was allowed to be remembered. A legacy of courage. The Forgotten Armies fought under foreign flags, but their courage was their own. They carried no illusions of glory, only the will to survive. In their endurance lies a story of humanity's shared suffering, one that transcends empire, race, and nation. When we remember the Great War, we must remember all of it. Not only the mud of Flanders, but the heat of East Africa. Not only the white crosses in France, but the unmarked graves beneath African soil. Not only the voices of poets, but the silence of millions who had no words. Because the Great War was not just a European tragedy, it was a global one. And the men who fought it, whether from Delhi or Dakar, Sydney or Kingston, deserve to stand side by side in memory, no longer forgotten but finally home.